see if I can get this on there. Just in case you couldn't see them here, you can see them there. But I'm glad that the bishop and Larry are here to talk about this question about how does the Episcopal Church engage or not engage in questions of public policy. It was a question that has been raised to me. Isn't this inserting the church's foot in politics and those kinds of things? And that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm just going to leave it up to them, and I trust that all of the technology will work correctly to those who are joining us online or later.
Right. Good. Well, thank you all for joining us. We're grateful that you're here, especially when there's a little bit of a conflict going on in London right now.
We're winning, I understand, however.
So that's very good. What Bishop Chris and I have decided to do is I'm going to start off with a little bit of some experiences this year with the Episcopal Church getting involved in some serious public policy issues and debates. And I'm going to start with a 40 or 50-year-old example that turned out to be pretty successful, so that my point will be that we've been doing this for quite some time anyway. And then the bishop will give you some biblical and scriptural foundation for doing what we're doing. And then we can at some point talk about what else the Episcopal Church offers in the way of educating people and training people if they wish to be advocates for the positions that the church has taken and how the church takes a position on things like this. So I wanted to start off by talking about the 40 or 50-year experience of our church fighting apartheid in South Africa, where we became colleagues with the Anglican Church in South Africa to do whatever we could do from far away to dismantle the system of that was terrible racism against, as you know, the black people of South Africa. And our church became active in that as early as 1958. We started taking positions, and you'll hear this over and over, but generally the church takes positions after the General Convention approves of that or requests it or directs it. General Convention, as you know, is the ultimate and highest authority in our church. It meets every 3 years, and it's made up of two houses, a House of Bishops and a House of Deputies. The deputies are lay and clerical people, the clergy people. And if they both agree on something, then that becomes the position of the church with respect to public policy and social justice issues. And that started as early, as I say, in the late 50s, where it began. The General Convention said that the church and church institutions, meaning dioceses and even parishes, should divest from South Africa. That went on then for several years. In 72, we made further really concrete steps to sort of take our money and put it elsewhere in terms of ownership of investments that are done for endowment funds, primarily, that are held by the church and by many churches. They're invested so that they can put to good use and make some money. But we thought it was contrary to church teaching to support institutions such as General Motors and other corporate entities that were seemingly in support, or at least tolerated, what was going on in South Africa. In 1985, the General Convention approved a resolution which mandated the divestment of its holdings in any business, any company that does business in South Africa or Namibia. It also urged all dioceses, parishes, and church-affiliated institutions to do the same thing. In 1988, based upon a call from the Anglican Archbishop of South Africa, and you all know who he was, Desmond Tutu, General Convention passed a resolution to boycott major international oil companies, such as Shell, that were operating there. We were part of a large faith coalition around certainly the communion and around the world. It wasn't just the Episcopal Church, but it ultimately did have a role in changing that incredible system that was so bad there. In 2025, and you're going to see in a minute why I mentioned apartheid in South Africa, because it's going to surface again in 2025. But in 2025, the church became very active in political issues in this country with the change of administrations. And one of the first things that happened very early in 2025, which was really upsetting to all of us in the church, is that for 40 years, but especially in the most recent 20 years, up until early 2025, the Episcopal Church had a contract with the federal government for Episcopal Migration Ministries. It was one of the really stellar ministries, in my estimation, one of the stellar ministries of our church. And for 20 years, we had been funded to the extent that we could resettle, and did resettle 110,000 refugees in this country. And that involved helping them find work, helping them find English second language courses, helping them find apartments and furniture. It was really everything across the board, a fabulous ministry. We couldn't afford to do it ourselves, but the federal government paid for it. We were contracting with the federal government, and that money stopped with almost no warning. It was really like 4 weeks of warning, and we had to let 22 to 24 full-time employees go because the church doesn't have the budget to pick that up. And the reason I mentioned apartheid is then that was like late January, early February, and we're really, really distressed at this. And then in May, the Episcopal Church was approached by the federal government again to reopen that contract, but only to the extent that we would resettle white Afrikaners from South Africa. And we rejected that. We said, we're not going to do that because that is also racist. You're putting those people at the front of the line over people who've been here and were expecting to be resettled under the program until you just stopped the funding. And we were not going to do it. And so the presiding bishop told the federal government, we don't work that way, where you tell us which refugees are okay to work with and which are not. We thought that it was really inconsistent with the gospel and particularly with Matthew 25. And this is something that we couldn't live with, even though it was something we did before with such great pride. In response to that, the Archbishop of South Africa confirmed that he really was grateful for that stance because the church in South Africa also was troubled by it. That was the first thing in 2025 I want to mention briefly here. The second thing was in February, the executive committee of the Executive Council, and I know you all know this, but between general conventions, there's an elected executive council that really makes the decisions and keeps the church moving forward and approves spending the money. And obviously you can't get the general convention, which has 800 deputies and 150 to 250 bishops. You can't get them together on a Zoom call to do anything like this. So the Executive Council really is there to steer the ship between general conventions. And there was a move in, as I say, in February of this year, we got very distressed because actually, I'm almost sure it was on the day of President Trump's inauguration that the new Homeland Security Secretary said, we are going to change the policy. It was not law, but we're going to change the policy that before we would really strive not to do any arrests for deportation or immigration issues in sensitive spaces, such as churches, schools, and hospitals. And the administration obviously was in support of that. And that was very troubling to us because our churches, we've always held, and the bishop maybe even will touch on this, we've always served as sanctuaries for people who are in trouble. And it seemed very inconsistent with our right to practice religion in Christianity as we believe it is to be practiced. And so the executive committee, which is executive council, is about 36 people elected to make these decisions of steering the ship, as I say, between general conventions. There's a small executive committee of that, which are the two presiding officers, and there are two chairs of standing committees that are executive council standing committees. I happen to be one of those, and then there are about, I think, 6 elected members. So it's a smaller group of maybe 6 to 8 people, something like that. And we approved that the Episcopal Church should join in a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security, which is where this policy change had been announced. And the goal was to try to get a temporary injunction that this policy change should not happen until the entire change had gone through a legal process and a legal review by the courts. We joined, there were 27 faith groups that joined in this action in February of this year in filing the lawsuit. And because I think it's only fair that you know where I stand on these kind of things. Because I was chair of one of these committees on Go, I was quoted in several of the church media things. And I said that the filing of this lawsuit demonstrates the commitment of the Episcopal Church to migrants and others as we strive to follow the gospel imperative set forth in Matthew when Christ said, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me." I said much more than that, but that was pretty much what they would quote. We did not prevail on getting a temporary initial preliminary injunction. That in April that was turned down because they said that our church, even though we had some instances of what appeared to be really close to enacting the new policy change, where federal, mostly ICE enforcement officers would be parked outside a church and take pictures of people when they leave, or would be parked outside another church which has a food bank and take pictures of people who are in line for the food. But it wasn't the same thing as somebody had actually come into an Episcopal church and arrested somebody. That had, and as far as I know, I don't think that has still happened in our church, but it did happen in a couple of Quaker meeting houses. And so there was another lawsuit separate from this one, which was just, I believe, for 2 Quaker meeting houses, and they did get a preliminary injunction. That case is still active and will go forward, but it takes the normal course now without what we had hoped would be some initial help in terms of protecting the people that we minister to. The last thing I want to say at this point is, and we may come back to this a little bit, but we are not the only church that is, as you know, we're not the only church that's working really in good faith and to the best of our ability on immigration issues. And we have some colleagues in other denominations that are right there on the front line as well. And for those of you who were at the convention yesterday, this is almost, because this is chosen months in advance. This was the theme of our convention yesterday in Pueblo. We have a witness yet to make. And I think that's really relevant to what we're talking about this morning, I have to tell you. And it's how do we witness in this church, in this diocese. And Bishop Kim gave an incredible address yesterday that I think got us all really pumped up. It was right on the money. And I want to share with you, she was saying, you know, that we have this duty to others. It's a gospel duty to take care of other people, treat them with dignity, and provide them with the basic needs of life. And she said a couple of things. One she said was, justice does not mean just us are entitled to this stuff. That jumped out at me. And she said, our actions toward and for the most vulnerable people are a direct reflection of our relationship with God. So she and other leaders in the diocese are calling on people in the diocese to witness to the injustice and the inappropriate and sometimes really brutal behavior towards immigrants without addressing any issues of whether they're here legally or not. You know, they still need to be treated with dignity. And then I'll turn it over to Bishop Chris.
Right, thanks. Any questions specifically for Larry? We'll have plenty of time for discussion as we make our little presentation. Just underscoring about the fact that we ain't in this by ourselves, that virtually all these kinds of public policy statements that we make or stands that we take are supported ecumenically and even interreligiously. We often have Jewish and sometimes Muslim, Hindu, Sikhs, and others, but certainly we have our full communion partners like the ELCA, the Lutheran Church, the Roman Catholic Church. Roman Catholic Church, as you probably have read, are huge on immigration because obviously they are a church of immigrants more than any of the rest of us. Pope Leo said the other day, made an apostolic exhortation, which was basically a completing of a document that Pope Francis had started and was about care for the poor and love for the poor. But in the process of that, he dealt with immigration. And caring for the stranger. I mean, it's such an obvious thing from Matthew 25. And all the way through the Old Testament, there are references to caring for the aliens. They even use the word alien. That's not politically correct anymore, right? We're not supposed to say alien. And I agree with that. We shouldn't. That's undocumented if you want to talk about it, but not illegals. But at any rate, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, caring for those in your own land that are not of your people is something that we see over and over again. So the Roman Catholic Church is very concerned about immigration, and they, probably more than any other individual communion, have served as sanctuary places historically, back to the medieval times, that if you could make it to a church, you were going to be safe. And it may or may not have legal standing, that you are technically safe. But if the church stands with you, then you're going to have a certain amount of safety. You're going to have a certain amount of space to at least slow things down a little bit and make sure due process is followed and all of that. But there are churches of all denominations who have served as sanctuary for brief periods of time. But sometimes they've had people living in parish halls and all of that while their cases are being sorted through. On the legal matter, because these people have kids and children and families. But we always get the pushback that, the church should not be involved in politics. We have had such a history, I'm afraid, in the West particularly, of we are here to get you into heaven. I mean, that basically the church's job is to make sure that you behave and you do the right things, and then God is going to bless you, and when you die, you'll go to heaven. It's sort of an exit strategy. That's too much what we've been involved in. Hear me, we are indeed engaged in that business. We are talking about eternal life, and we're talking about life in a relationship with God and eternal. But the flip side of that is that we are not only to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind, but to love our neighbor as ourselves. And part of the mission of the people of God is to live that out. And sometimes that places us into conflict with the powers that be, if you will. And I don't know how we've sort of neglected to look at some of these passages, but if you go all the way back into Genesis to Revelation, as we read the Bible, the people of God are called from time to time to confront the powers that be. Beginning with Moses confronting the king, Pharaoh, to let my people go. That was a political action. That was a way of stating that God had a different agenda than Pharaoh did. And so the confrontation of the people of God with those who were, in that case, oppressing the people of God starts way back there. All the way through Nathan the prophet, you remember, King David was, while he was a great king, he also has his moral issues. And Nathan, who was normally a kind of supportive prophet for King David, at one point nailed him on his unfaithfulness. He told a story about a man with a little ewe lamb, you may recall that. And Nathan says to David, so David says, well, I would take care of that person. He did such an unjust thing. And Nathan says, you are the man in the story. So, that was a dangerous thing to do, but it was a confrontation with an injustice that was perceived from God's prophet. And then the prophetic literature itself, all the way through, we read these every Sunday, and we can take them out of context, or we can recognize that the major and minor prophets were confronting the powers that be. Sometimes those were kings and leaders and rulers. Sometimes they were priests and the authorities that be within the people of God. Sometimes prophecy is not just against the external, the prophecy is often internal and addresses abuses of the church. We could see that in the Reformation, I suppose, when people like Martin Luther stood up against abuses in the church. Those are all political in the sense that they're dealing with the interaction between human beings and how we live out our lives in the public square, if you will. So all the way through major and minor prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, all the way through Micah. Some of them are scary. Some of the hard language that we hear in the Hebrew Bible are just that. God's anger channeled through the prophets. Now, I'm not sure God was as angry as the prophets are. I think sometimes the prophets' own humanity gets in the way, but nonetheless, there is confrontation. John the Baptist clearly followed in that long line of prophets. Some people consider him the last of the great Hebrew prophets, unless you want to consider Jesus the last of the Hebrew prophets. But Jesus stands in a kind of separate category, even though he had a prophetic ministry of his own. But John the Baptist clearly was there to call the people of God together, and he confronted Herod with the fact that God was king and Herod was not. He convicted Herod of his sin. And as John the Baptist began to call people out and gather them together for baptism and as a community, again, the powers that be were quite threatened by that. Is this going to be a new revolutionary? Is this going to be someone who's raising up an army to come against us? There's always been that worry with oppressors, and the Roman Empire being chief among them during those times. Anytime people got roused up and were gathered together in groups and were critical of the powers that be, it's just going to be a revolution. Well, it wasn't an armed revolution. It was a revolution of a different sort. And John the Baptist continued, as did Jesus. Jesus and Paul, clearly nonviolent resistors. I mean, they were both people who resisted. Jesus resisted up to his very death at the hands of the state and of the church, if you will, but did so nonviolently, turning the other cheek. Some of the things that Jesus talked about were actually revolutionary activities. Going the second mile, turning the other cheek, those were things that you would do in the face of an oppressor to actually reveal them as oppressors. Walter Wink is a great New Testament scholar that wrote a lot about resisting the powers and how many of Jesus's actions were just that. They were nonviolent resistances. He was not engaged in leading an armed revolution to overthrow the Roman government. That was not his agenda, nor was it John the Baptist. But the resistance to the kind of abuses of human rights and dignity and freedom, he was indeed standing against. With the Matthew 25 passage, with the Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the poor. Luke says, blessed are the poor. Matthew softens it and says, blessed are the poor in spirit. But Luke was saying the poor themselves are blessed just by the very fact that they rely on God completely and totally and have to. So we see this through the Bible, and then it continues really down through church history. People like St. Francis and other monastics, the original Desert Fathers and Mothers, they were rejecting the society as it was and trying to create an alternative lifestyle. And their very existence was a challenge to the way things were. Power, money, influence being the driving forces. No, they said poverty, living in complete obedience to and acceptance of God's grace in our lives. That's what this is all about. St. Francis chose to be poor and gave away everything that he had in order to show solidarity with the poor. Not that poverty is a good thing, but standing in solidarity with those who are poor is what Jesus calls us to do, and call people like Francis and Benedict and all the rest of the monastics up down through the Middle Ages were all about. Right up until quasi-modern times, William Wilberforce was an Anglican Church of England member of Parliament who was anti-slavery and fought the battle against slavery in England long before we addressed it here with any kind of seriousness. And he was, certainly criticized for that. What are you doing? Coming against the Church of England, the established church, and yet he was coming against its policy around slavery. And we trace that through, as you've talked about, the civil rights movement, both in our own country and around the world when we dealt with apartheid and trying to stand against that. Martin Luther King Jr., obviously, is probably the most clear example of a latter-day prophet that most of us remember. And he clearly came right out of the church. That was his, he preached about this. He was not a politician, he was a prophet. and yet he engaged in the political arena by virtue of the fact that he was offering a prophetic word to the state. So when we talk about that, even though we have all these long history, there is always this concern that we're meddling in politics. There clearly has to be a distinction made between partisanship and politics. The church is not to be partisan, and never is not acceptable to be partisan or to support specific political candidates, political parties. But politics itself is simply the engagement of human beings in community trying to live out their lives, and the church has a role to play in that. So often the First Amendment to the Constitution is quoted as saying, separation of church and state. How many times have you heard that in recent days? Separation of church and state is what this country was founded upon, meaning the church can't get involved or have a voice in the public square. That is not what the First Amendment says or intends. First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. I mean, that's a pretty radical statement in the sense of going to the root of things and being bold. Our founders were terrified of a state-sponsored religion. They were terrified of the fact that you could somehow meld the voice of God and the voice of the king, as they had experienced in England and elsewhere in Europe. That was their great fear, that the state would establish a religion. That's what it meant to separate church and state, not that the church had no public voice. Indeed, we are among the citizens who are able to have free speech, press, to write things that are perhaps controversial, to assemble peacefully, like we do on Sunday mornings, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It is our right under the Constitution, as it is every citizen, to speak with that kind of voice. Anything else on legal or constitutional stuff?
I'm glad you mentioned the First Amendment, because that's one of the bases for the Episcopal Church's lawsuit joining the other 26 faith communities. But that's not the only reason, the only basis for it. There's also a reasonably obscure federal law that's basically referred to as like the restoration of religious freedoms. It's primarily was enacted by the Congress with respect to real estate, where local communities would say, we don't want, the extreme, we don't want a Muslim church here with someone calling us to prayer 5 or 6 times a day, or we don't want a church here because of the traffic it will offer, or we don't want a church here because it's going to have a food bank and feed poor people. And so there are laws and the statutes at the federal level that there has to be compelling reason if the state at any level is going to restrict the ability of a church to do its ministries. So we put those in there as well. But you're exactly right that it is not the separation of church and state, open and shut, black and white. That is not what's going on here. And it's really important. I also was glad that you talked about the recent letter from the Pope, because a lot of people are interpreting that as saying, I acknowledge that there are some bishops, some Roman Catholic bishops in this country that have really stepped out and taken a public position that says what is happening with respect to immigration is inconsistent with the teachings of the Catholic Church. But the Pope seemed to be saying, in many people's opinions, that is an important position to take, and it should be taken by all of the U.S. bishops, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. That gets back into this notion of how do we witness? We're called upon to be witnesses, and we need to do that both individually, both at parish levels and lower levels, but definitely I think a witness tends to be more effective if it can be something like the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, something like the Episcopal Church, something like the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. When what's going on publicly is inconsistent with our teachings, we would say we have an obligation to respond to that in whatever legal and nonviolent way we can come up with. And that's why, Bishop, I'm really glad you brought that up as well. In the Episcopal Church, and this is the last thing I'll say, and then we'll open it for questions. In the Episcopal Church, I know you have this general sense that the Episcopal Church will take these positions only after General Convention action. That's really important, because General Convention is our opportunity as a greater and larger community to speak on behalf of the church and what this church is all about and what it believes in and what it believes it's called to do in its ministries to people. And I agree totally with the bishop, and I don't know any Episcopalian who doesn't, that even though there have been some notices from the current administration with respect to the Internal Revenue Service that it probably is okay for a pastor or a priest in a pulpit to say, I want you to vote for candidate A and not candidate B.
Let me just read.
Oh, good.
I just got this.
Okay.
It says that the president is praising an Internal Revenue Service court filing which effectively clears the way for churches to endorse political candidates, a reversal of decades of legal precedent. Yet half a dozen religious leaders told ABC they don't foresee a large increase in political endorsements from their peers, despite last week's IRS court filing. The filing would not revoke nonprofit status from two Texas churches, Sand Springs Church and the First Baptist Church, Wascom, for doing so. The filing formalizes for the first time a lack of enforcement of the 1954 Johnson Amendment, which prohibits nonprofits from endorsing or opposing political candidates if they want to remain tax exempt. So historically, that's been the case. Now there's some softening of that around the edges. But bishops in at least 6 dioceses of the Episcopal Church have issued statements on how their clergy should act in the light of this recent change in tax policy regarding nonprofits, which would permit houses of worship to endorse candidates. On July 7th, the IRS set its policy on the Johnson Amendment, blah, 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 would no longer apply to communications from the house of worship. In each of the bishop's statements, they either strongly urged their clergy to refrain from endorsing political candidates or outright prohibited the practice. They all, however, reiterate that preaching the gospel or speaking on matters relating to the care of the poor and most vulnerable is part of the call of all Christians. Michigan Bishop Bonnie Perry offered these guidelines to her clergy. Speak boldly on any issue relating to the gospel of Jesus Christ, citing biblical texts and sound Anglican theological precepts, and refrain from endorsing any specific political candidate or political party. So, I mean, you can't be any clearer than that. So when the criticism comes that we are either supporting the president, the current president, or the last president, or whatever, it's the policy issue that the church is speaking to, not the person, the individual, or the party for which that person stands. The church has been on supporting policies that both parties and none have advocated over the years. So we have this process, and just a little more word about the General Convention process itself, how resolutions come to be. You want to talk about that?
Let me start with that, and I'll do a little bit, and then you jump in. And,
gotcha.
Basically, as you are aware, every diocese elects 4 clergy deputies and 4 lay deputies to each General Convention. And so that means there's basically 8 from every diocese, regardless of the size of the diocese. So we have some dioceses with as few as 12 or 13 churches, and we have some, with a couple hundred churches. But it's sort of like the U.S. Senate. It's equal to in representation. Those 8 people go to the House of Deputies, which, as I mentioned, I think a little earlier, is one of the 2 houses with the House of Bishops, and every resolution, every budget, every new program, everything that comes out of a General Convention, or a canon or constitution change, has to be exactly the same in format, in language, and in grammar in the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies. So a bill will start maybe in the House of Deputies, and then it'll go to the House of Bishops. They'll change a little bit, then it comes back. It's a sort of a fun legislative process if you're a nerd like I tend to be. But the bottom line is that any bishop in the House of Bishops, of course, can introduce any resolution saying, we really want to strongly emphasize that we are upset with what's going on in Gaza, or we're really upset with the fact that environmental regulations are being severely diminished, and that there's no longer an acknowledgement that there's a climate issue in this world, or we're really upset with how people are being taken almost willy-nilly and put into deportation situations without proper process. It's everything. This is not just about immigration today. It's everything under the sun that's contrary to the gospel teachings. In the House of Deputies, resolutions like any of those I just mentioned can come first of all from any diocese. If a diocesan convention wants to send a resolution to General Convention, it will take action at its local annual convention. They can come from any of the interim bodies. In the church, we have 2 standing commissions that are charged with many, many things in the years between general conventions, and we probably have at least a dozen, if not maybe as many 20 task forces and short-term committees that they all have their own agendas in terms of their charges. And some of those are to look at ministries inside the country and ministries outside the country, and some are dealing with worship and music, and some are prayer book, and some are insurance, you name it.
Just for a non-controversial example, I was on the Standing Commission on Ecumenical Relations in the days when we were hammering out our relationship with the Lutheran Church and coming into full communion with the ELCA. And we had to craft resolutions which would go to the General Convention to be voted upon. It had to start with the House of Bishops, because all ecumenical relations do. But then, as you say, it has to go to the deputies, and they can change it and come back and forth. And if it sounds familiar to you, it sounds like Congress, right? God forbid. God save us. I used to always say, if it sounds familiar, it's because the same people who wrote the Constitution wrote the Constitution for the Episcopal Church. And there's a lot of truth in that. Although today I kind of hate to hold us up in tandem with Congress. I actually think we're working better than Congress in this particular moment. But the point is, it's a similar thing. You have a smaller deliberative house, which is the Senate in politics, and is the House of Bishops in our case. You have a larger, more representative body, which is the House of Representatives in Congress, and the House of Deputies, made up of lay people and priests and deacons. And so they have to come to this common term. So it's the people of God who are making these decisions. And I think that's one of the things that maybe separates those of us in the more Protestant world than the Roman Catholic Church. It doesn't come down from the Pope on a policy. The bishops can initiate things, but it has to be approved, accepted, and transformed by lay people, deacons, and priests, and then voted on.
Yes, so on that, there's all these good faith propositions or positions taken by the church. So if I think about any other, all these wonderful initiatives, how do you determine which ones get their attention? How do you determine which ones get the money and the manpower that are most important? How do you prioritize that?
That is a terrific question. From the House of Deputies perspective, it really comes down to whether the resolution that sets up this position includes what it would really like to suggest is the financing and where it should come from. But none of that's going to happen until the budget is done. So it's almost a 2-step process. You first may take the position, and you want to make that position meaningful, meaning that it's got to have some financial support for it. But if you also can't get the House to go along with putting it in the budget, it's not likely to happen. House of Bishops, similar?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually developed in recent years. For a time there, we were passing all these kinds of grandiose resolutions without any funding.
Unmandated, right?
Unmandated.
Unfunded mandates.
Unfunded mandates. That's
mandates.
exactly right.
Yeah.
And so it got to be kind of silly. It was just words. There was no teeth in it as far as having funds to carry these things out. So that in recent years, I think it's mandated that they have some kind of funding implication for any resolution that goes forward. And as far as what rises to the top, it really is just the amount of support that it gets when it comes to the floor. How overwhelmingly is it supported by both bishops and deputies?
What would be the top 5 initiatives in the Episcopal Church?
I can tell you policy areas, not necessarily, maybe policy areas, and this gets us into talking about the Office of Government Relations. We have this very small office. It sounds pretty grandiose, the Office of Government Relations. I think there's 4 people that are employed in New York that work out of our church center headquarters. But their job is not to come up with these grand resolutions themselves or their own pet peeves that they want to redress from the government. They only can support those things that come from General Convention in the following areas. Creation care deals with the environment. That's why we're concerned about some of the legislation that's going on, or not legislation so much, executive orders that are going on about drill, baby, drill. Sorry, but it's a shorthand. Are we going to pay attention to the environment or not? That's creation care is tops. Racial reconciliation is second. Anything that has to do with racial profiling, racial prejudice, the kind of things that we would have understood during the civil rights movement, which is still continuing today, I would say. Racial reconciliation, ending poverty, the whole idea of how we treat the poor. I don't remember what great leader it was that said the test of a great nation is how it treats its poor. So that's one. Migration, refugees, and immigration. Roll those all together. Migration is anybody who's moving for any reason. Refugees are those who have some reason for us to believe they're being persecuted, that if they go back to their own country, they might be imprisoned or killed or oppressed in some other way. And immigration, of course, is anybody who's here legally, I would say, legal immigration. And finally, human rights and peace building. That's kind of a broad category. But so creation care, racial reconciliation, ending poverty, migration, and peace building are the things that this office categorizes everything. If it doesn't fit into one of those 5, they're probably not going to spend much time trying to implement it. They're pretty broad, obviously, but I think you can see pretty clearly how those things relate to the Bible. Relate to our faith,
yes.
How we care for the world, how we treat poor people and the stranger and the sojourner, human dignity. All those things are things that this church and all Christian churches worthy of the name stand for.
And we have so many people in this room who have been active in so many of these areas. Father Gary with Creation Care, which is really right at the forefront of that. Deacon Nadine and Reverend Sandra with immigration issues, and even going to the extent of joining people at deportation and immigration status hearings. And a lot of the people in this room, of course, are interested in, and you guys are all so supportive of St. Clair's and the ministries to the poor. So how do we continue to move in the direction of trying to identify what would be an important thing to prioritize? I mentioned how some of the resolutions can come to the House of Deputies from dioceses. They can also come from deputies. I want Nadine to be aware of that because she's a new deputy, as you know, and definitely those interim bodies that we talked about and touched on. That's I'm going to say a very large part of their charge is to say, we've looked at this. This is working, or this is not working, or this is something new we should try. We get a lot of stuff from them. But that is why there are usually between 450 and 600 resolutions that go to a general convention, which is totally unworkable and unmanageable. But that's been, been our experience. Yeah. And there are always efforts to deal with that. But we have, as the bishop said, we have this great ability at the grassroots level, which mostly I think of as us lay people, frankly, to
the 99%ers, you guys are the 99%.
And I could, if I do a sidebar, some of you know I teach church polity and stuff. I think the most significant contribution that the Episcopal Church has made to the Anglican Communion and all of Christianity is to give an equal voice to all of the orders, meaning the lay orders, the priest and deacons orders, and the bishop's orders. I think that is huge, and we've seen that now in the last almost 250 years. And I'm really grateful for that. That's one of the millions of things I love about this church. But
Yeah, and, you know, if you're at General Convention or even Diocesan Convention, you can see how much work it goes into this. You know, somebody will have a resolution and it'll go to a committee, and the committee, just like in Congress, and the committee has to sort it out and argue about it, and it gets refined, and sometimes it gets softened, and sometimes maybe it gets even made a little more teeth by the discussion, and then it goes to the floor of the convention itself, and in the Diocese of Colorado, that's probably what, a couple hundred people, or
It's about 300 this weekend.
and so the debate takes place, and of course it's all voted in one body because there's not two houses in a Diocesan convention, so you're all. But it has to have support. It doesn't just drop down either from heaven or just come out from somebody's mind that has a particular axe to grind. It's sorted through. And then that diocesan grassroots resolution goes to General Convention. The same process is followed. All these minds and hearts and perspectives are wrestling with this before it comes out fully grown. So when people have a tendency to say, well, you're talking about politics and you're liberals or you're conservatives or whatever the issue may be, I think that short circuits and really doesn't do any service to the amount of both faith and prayer and time that goes into these things being produced. I don't know if it's happening at General Convention anymore, but there was a time under Bishop Browning and under presiding Bishop Griswold where we actually met around tables at the Eucharist, and the scriptures were read and the sermon was preached, and then we had time to interact with each other around that, and sometimes that had direct correlation with a particular legislative action that was going to take place on the floor. So it's not done in a partisan kind of political way. It's hopefully done in a faithful way. The reason it gets sometimes a little dicey is if you criticize a policy, there's a tendency then to be seen as criticizing the person, whether it's the executive or a particular political party. And we really need to avoid that. It's not personal, it's policy. And that's why we call it public policy.
And I want to say another thing too, because I'm so grateful that you're all here and interested in this. And one of the few silver linings of the pandemic was that the General Convention had to really rethink how it does business for all the obvious reasons. And one of the things that came out of that continues and will be continuing for the next General Convention is that we will have open online hearings that anyone can watch and listen to well in advance, 2 to 4 to 5 months in advance of General Convention, that talks about these proposals, these proposed resolutions. And not only are these open and you can listen to them, but you can sign up to testify. You do not have to be a deputy. You do not have to be in the next General Convention in Phoenix itself. All of us sitting here could do that. And this started in 2022, and then it continued in 2024 and will be for the 2027 General Convention. But I remember in 2024, I was going to testify before another committee on something that was affect one of the things I was interested in, which was the archives. And the committee hearing was on a Saturday morning, and we had already promised, Shelley and I had promised to take the grandchildren to the zoo. So we were at the zoo, and I went and found a tree in a shady area, and I did my testimony.
Is that grassroots?
There you go. Yeah. But it's a wonderful system. None of it's perfect ever, but it has opened up the process so much more, and that's a huge benefit, as I say, from being forced to do that by the pandemic.
And that's just an increasing democratization of the church, of the way that this church, at least, functions. There have been criticisms that the General Convention is a certain amount of elitism in the General Convention, because who can afford to take off work for 3 weeks? So there's a tendency from General Convention people to be people who have some means and are able to do that. And so the more we can find ways to hear the voice all the way truly from the grassroots, the better it will be.
What are your thoughts, questions? Also really interested in what you think about all this.
Where can we find out information that we can understand what the committees are doing?
There are really good websites at the Episcopal Church level. I have to tell you, I'm really very
So
impressed.
national,
Yes, and you can talk to any of us who are been fortunate enough to be elected to go and say, as it gets closer, like a year before and 6 months before, and we'll be able to tell you where the websites are. We also try to publicize that, of course, as a deputation and let people know what's going on. Also, and this has never been a problem at Good Shepherd or at the other church that we attend in Breckenridge, because I sort of push it, we will go to, deputation members would love to, every Sunday, to go to churches in the 6 months preceding General Convention to talk about what we expect to be the hot items and where you can learn about it. And we always say we want to go, we're willing to go, we even have a coordinator who will do it, but very few churches take us up on it, sadly.
They're not nerds.
Yeah, that's true.
Let me tell you one other great resource, and that's something called the Episcopal Policy Network, Public Policy Network. If you Google Episcopal Public Policy Network, you don't even have to go through, initially go through the church website, although you can get to it that way too, episcopalchurch.org. But if you go to Episcopal Public Policy Network, you can sign up and become a member of that for nothing. And then every month or so, you will get an email that tells you something that the church is concerned about and allows you to, because you put in your address and all the rest, to write a letter to your congressperson about this issue. And there's a form letter that you can use, or you can change it completely and make it your own, or you can, I always add things and subtract things from it. But it gives you the background, it gives you all the General Convention resolutions that have supported this particular concern, and now maybe there's a bill in Congress, or maybe there's some action that's about to be taken. And if you want your voice as an Episcopalian to be heard, that is an instantaneous way to do it, painless way to do it. And yet it mounts up. The people in Congress listen to their constituents. If they like, I think phone calls are probably the most effective, and maybe hard copy letters are more effective than emails. But nonetheless, if Michael Bennett gets 1,000 emails on an immigration issue from Colorado, he's going to pay attention. Yes. And it's designed so that it's only your representatives and senators that are going to hear from you. You can't write Nebraska off the Political Policy Network. You can do that on your own. But if you want to use this, and each letter begins, as an Episcopalian and your constituent, which I think is important.
I do. I just want to say that the Episcopal Migration Ministry National Office does a weekly 30-minute
Yes.
update on Tuesday mornings at 11 o'clock that you can sign up for and watch. And it's fascinating because what they're doing is overview of what's going on with the migration ministries. As it's, it's what they're doing as they're no longer able to do what they were doing for so many generations. And it also, sometimes, in fact, twice or three times this month, it'll be not just 30 minutes of update, but there will be another 30 minutes that will focus on various dioceses and what they're doing on the ground about migration ministries and what they're facing, whether it's Texas or California or whoever. And it's fascinating to hear what they're doing in the various dioceses. And also the Office of Government Relations has a weekly 30-minute update on Thursdays.
Right.
And you have to be retired to be able to plug in. But I think you can sign up and watch it later to tell you, that gives you it's just really quick and you have to be really, but it's very interesting and it's countrywide. And that's how the church is connecting nationally to locally.
All this is going on, constantly, sort of under the radar. We don't realize that our church, which is really a very small church, 1.9 million or whatever we claim to be today, although I don't know how we even count ourselves anymore. It's difficult. But we're not a large communion, and yet there are congregations that are doing soup kitchens or kind of things that we're supportive of here. There are places that are doing migration ministries on the ground, taking care of a refugee family, helping them walk
Yes.
through the process, and Episcopal Migration Ministries teaches these people in dioceses how to do that.
And that's sort of their new focus, because they can't do the resettlement stuff anymore.
And that's not all bad in the sense it won't all be done sort of out of New York. It'll be done on the ground, which is that's where the church is the strongest. And our new presiding bishop, Sean Rowe, is really big on that. He thinks the whole reason New York exists, the church center in New York, is to empower local congregations and dioceses to do the work.
I was just gonna say, that actually, I know a little bit about EMM, that is their model, that they got the federal funding and they had to give it to local churches and dioceses to fund local projects. That's what is now gone.
Right.
Of course, and they're looking at different ways of using their funding and raising awareness, and also in Europe, because we have given grants to the church in Europe for the refugees in the refugee center in Rome.
In Rome.
And they're looking at maybe trying to do some work there too.
I've been to that parish in Rome. It's called St. Paul's Within the Walls, because there's a major Roman Catholic church that's St. Paul's outside the walls for some reason. I don't know how it got switched, but we are St. Paul within the walls. And Bishop Pierre Whalen used to be the rector of that parish. When I was the ecumenical officer, I was there for his consecration as bishop and went to that parish, St. Paul's. And it's right there in Rome in a kind of shady area, and they are just migrants coming in every day for food, for education, for being taught language, and
Make it work.
absolutely. And that's our little tiny church, our little Episcopal church. And again, as an ecumenical-minded person, I would say that our witness, the witness that we have, is compounded the more we work ecumenically. I mean, the ELCA is twice the size that we are. And they stand with us just cheek by jowl as far as issues are concerned. There's not a sliver of daylight between those two churches. The United Methodist Church is twice the size of the Lutheran Church. I mean, they've had their own schism recently, so they're a little smaller. But, I think there are 8 million or so of United Methodists. And with all of us together, that's really a voice for the gospel to be heard in a way that, unfortunately, most Americans don't think that's what the church stands for. They see all the publicity of the so-called religious right, and they think that's what Christianity stands for. But I guarantee you, I will support our interpretation from the Bible and the tradition far and away against those kinds of knee-jerk responses that come out of the so-called evangelicals. I think we evangelicals are at our best.
Three things. First is thank you. This has been spectacular. Second thing is, many of you know this, the thing about the wall of separation, that was Jefferson in 1802. So this was not in 1789, this was in 1802.
Right.
And it was the Baptists who were arguing for the wall of separation, because they didn't want that established church.
Right, exactly.
They felt the
Fiercely independent.
of established churches, and they didn't want it anymore. So, so that's a little bit different. And then there's this wonderful passage in Acts about the Jerusalem Council, and they're trying to decide how to include non-Jews, and kind of the summary statement is, it has pleased the Holy Spirit and us that we should not do all of this kind of stuff. And and so there's the politics right there.
Yeah.
Is how does,
Yes.
and you were talking about all of this grassroots stuff, and all of the committees, and all of the, is that, rather than thinking about it as politics at work, is that the way, can you think about that as the way the Holy Spirit works?
Yep.
Through us as fallible individuals, to make sure that what we come up with is as close to the mind of God as we can get.
Yep.
So, anyway, I thought that this was absolutely spectacular. Again, we've gone an hour, and so I'm just so grateful. I know they'll continue to answer questions.
Sure. We'll hang around if you want to chat.
But thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.